Okay, so this is a quick tutorial on how to solder up the HackBerry Helper PCB. So to do this, you're going to need a variety of materials. You're going to need all of your soldering tools. You're also going to need your HackBerry Helper PCB. You'll need your ESP32, your battery, two 10K resistors, two of these big push buttons, an RGB LED, and two of these female header strips. So as you can see, we've got a lot to solder on. Now, one of the most important parts to keep in mind is that for this tutorial, we are not actually soldering the ESP32 board to the PCB. If we did that, we wouldn't be able to ever get this out, and we want to use these things later on. So don't, whatever you do, don't solder this to the PCB. That's what we're going to use these female header pins for. These are going to get soldered into the board and allow us to plug the ESP32 in and out. So we're going to clean up our space. And just like we did with our previous solder trainer, we're going to start with the components that sit the flattest on the board first, and that's usually our resistors. And so these are going to be two 10K resistors, and you may want to make sure that you check the values before you solder them in. Otherwise, you might be in for a bit of a trip of desoldering. And I'm just going to pull these nice and tight to make sure that they're sitting as flat as they can on the board. Okay, so we'll put these in. Okay. Great. Okay. And I'm going to place those up like this. And we'll come through and we'll tack those in place. Now, you got to be really careful that you only tack the joints that you intend to. And you also want to make sure that when you put the components in, you're putting them on the side where the silk screen is. And so you can kind of see that there's a little R1 there and an R2. And that tells you that the component goes on this side. If you put the components on the wrong side, that's going to be not great because you've got components on both sides of the board. Okay, so make sure you're putting them on the right side, and then come down and we'll add a little bit of solder to each of these pads, and we will get them tacked in. Okay, now as you're doing this, again, we're kind of looking for good, solid coverage on those solder pads. We're going to make sure the entire solder pad is nice and clean. Okay, so those look pretty good. Now at this point, you definitely want to trim these off. We don't want to, like, I've seen people like come and like twist these together, and that's definitely what we don't want to do. We want to make sure that we keep our boards nice and clean and in good shape. Okay, so this is looking pretty good so far. So next thing that we can do is kind of our next tallest component. And for that, we've got kind of a decision between, these buttons. We've got our RGB LED. And I think if we kind of hold these next to each other, it looks like our RGB LED is going to be a little bit shorter. So we're going to do it next. And we're going to save, these guys are going to go in on the other side of the board. So we're going to save these for last. Okay, let's do our LED. Now it's really important. There is a right way and a wrong way to plug these in. And if you look at the LED, you'll see that one side is very rounded and one side is very flat. And that's going to help you orient these correctly. You will notice that on the board, you've got an area that is very rounded on this side, and then there's a flat part kind of cut off right there. And so you want to make sure that the flat side of the LED, and triple check this, because if you get it wrong, you'll pretty much have to start all over again, and that would just be a tragedy. Make sure that the flat side is right up against that little D1, and it should slide in and snap kind of all the way to the end. Okay, so it should sit really flush on the board. Now to hold that flush, we're going to use just a piece of tape to kind of hold that in place. And just like we kind of learned about in our solder trainer board, these pads are really close together, and it can be really easy to accidentally kind of solder two pins together. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to solder this pin right here, trim them all short, and then come in and solder the rest. Now for this, you want to make sure, since we're kind of doing some detailed work here, make sure you've got a fine tip on your soldering iron, and you've got a nice clean tip so you don't have just big blobs of solder that are going to get all over the place. So we're going to come in. I'm just going to add just a tiny bit of solder there, and that's just going to hold it in place. And this point, we can come in, and again, I'm going to trim them pretty short to the board. You'll notice that on these, there's kind of a little flattened area here. You can actually cut right below that, so that there's just a smidgen of pieces held up. So you can see pretty much how short those are. Okay, and so at this point, again, we'll just walk right down the line and just add a small little bit of solder. Again, you don't need a ton for these little components. Just a small little bit to each part. Just feed in just a little bit. Yep, so just a little bit. I'm going to add just a bit more to this one, so it looked like it didn't get complete coverage. Okay, there we go. Okay, so here again we can see a little bit of solder on each of those pads, and it's holding it in nice and tight. Okay, next up we can do our buttons. Now with these caps do come off, so if for some reason you don't solder them in the right way, that's okay. You can always just pull the caps off and switch them around. But we're going to do green on top and red on bottom. And for these, let's see, well, I'm going to tape these in too because I don't want them to shift around. I want them to be nice and flat. So I'll take my piece of tape, and I'm going to try to do both of these at the same time. You can do them one at a time if you want. I'm going to see if I can get these to both go in at the same time. Again, we'll make sure that they're nice and flat against the board. Use that tape to keep them in place. So I see, as I do that, some of these aren't sitting perfectly flat. So in that case, I am going to go ahead and do one at a time so that I don't accidentally get one that's not sitting flush on the board. So I'm still going to use my piece of tape. There we go. That seems much better. Okay, and at this point, so these are pretty big holes, and so for these, you're going to need a lot of solder. And so go ahead and just fill that whole area up with solder. So make sure that that entire pad is filled up and covered. So those are mechanical holes as well as electrical, so you want to make sure that you get those whole areas covered so that as it gets pushed on, that it doesn't weaken that solder joint over time. Okay, let's go ahead and do this next one. Lots of solder. And really push that solder in there. So again, don't be shy with these big ones. They need lots of solder to make a nice strong joint. But if we flip it over, we can see that we've got some pretty strong joints. And again, just if for some reason we had messed this up, we could always swap these caps. So that would be just okay. Okay, so now at this point, we are going to work on the other side of the board, where we're going to add these strips. Now, on these strips, there are two different sizes, and that's because there's two different size strips here. And we might be tempted just to kind of like, throw these in here and kind of tape them in and solder them in place. But there's an issue is you can see how there's kind of a propensity for them to kind of wiggle about and maybe get in at a weird angle. And so to keep these straight, what we're going to do is we're actually going to take our ESP32 and we're going to go ahead and plug those in to those strips. And what's nice about this is that when we do that, and be gentle with the board, is it's going to hold it in at just the perfect angle. Okay, so we can put it in here, and now we're in good shape to begin soldering. Now, we might be tempted just to kind of start and just going down the line, but I'm going to show you a trick to make sure that your stuff is really well aligned. I'm going to solder one line there. Okay, I'm going to solder another line down here. Okay, and I'm going to kind of check to make sure that things are flat, because if they're not, then we can always kind of adjust it. But everything looks flat, and so now I'm going to solder the opposite end here and the opposite end here. And at this point, they're kind of pretty well tacked in place, so I can go in and start soldering all these other small little joints. And so that's what I'm going to do. So I'll come down here and just Again, just making sure that you don't miss any, and making sure that that pad gets full coverage. Just work your way down the line. And again, you don't want to spend too much time on any pad because that's going to begin to transfer heat into that ESP32. And we don't want to heat that up any more than it absolutely has to be. Okay, so let's work our way down. What's nice is you get lots of practice on soldering up these little joints, and you just let the heat do the work. Okay, I'm starting to kind of build up a little bit of solder on my tip, so every once in a while it's good just to kind of clean that tip off just to make sure that you don't get a big blob of solder building up on it. Just depending on how comfortable you feel, you may do this more often, or if you're feeling good about how much solder is on it, maybe not as often. Okay, so those are all looking pretty good. Okay, so clean the tip off. Okay, so now at this point, we're pretty much close to being done. So we've got our ESP32, and again, kind of conveniently, you can now kind of remove it if you want. When you do remove it, you got to be really careful. If you just kind of peel from one end, it's going to actually bend all those pins, and so you just have to very gently kind of rock it back and forth to pull it out. But at this point, there's no real reason to pull it out. You can just keep it nice and snapped in, and then we can take our battery here, and we can kind of place it in here and line it up with where it needs to go. Do a little bit of gymnastics here to get it to go in just right. But we plug it in, you can see that it's on. And the battery just kind of sits right underneath that. And here you can see that we've got a working HackBerry Helper. It's all ready to have a nice enclosure made for it and 3D printed. But this is where you want to be. And that's it.